I never thought I'd be telling this story. Even now, I question whether I imagined the whole thing, but it felt real, too real. I wasn't alone that night, but the others, well, they don't talk about it. I don't think they want to remember. But me, I can't forget. It started about a year ago. I'd been in a car accident, nothing too serious, but bad enough that I ended up in the hospital with a broken arm and a mild concussion. They admitted me for observation overnight. Just one night, they said. But that night, it changed everything. I was on the 4th floor of St. Helena Hospital, a place that's been around since the early 1900s. The building itself is old, with creaking floors, flickering lights, and a smell of antiseptic that never quite masks something stale. There's a wing on the north side that's permanently closed. Structural issues, the nurses say. But the rumors? They tell a different story. You see, St. Helena used to have a psychiatric ward. Back in the 1940s, patients there weren't treated, they were tortured. Experimental procedures, isolation, even stories of people disappearing. They shut that wing down after a massive fire killed several patients and staff. The fire gutted the ward, but the real story? People say the place never recovered. Not physically, not spiritually. I didn't think much of it at the time. Ghost stories, right? Just tales to scare interns and kids. I'd heard them before. But that night, well, let me tell you what happened. It was around midnight. I couldn't sleep. Hospitals are too loud for rest. Machines beeping, nurses chatting in the halls, patients moaning. I decided to grab some water from the nurses' station. My room was at the end of the corridor, far from the hub, so I had to pass a few empty rooms to get there. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The lights seemed dimmer than before, flickering slightly. The air grew colder with every step, and my skin prickled. I glanced into one of the empty rooms and froze. There was a woman standing by the window, staring out at the night. She wore a pale hospital gown, her long, dark hair hanging over her shoulders. I stepped back, my heart racing. "Ma'am?" I called out, though my voice cracked. She didn't move. I thought maybe she was confused or sleepwalking. I took a cautious step closer. "Ma'am, do you need help?" She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her face in the dim light. Her eyes, they weren't right. They were empty, hollow. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent, and her mouth, it twisted into a grin that sent a chill straight down my spine. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. When I looked up again, she was gone. Just gone. I ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I told myself I was imagining things. The concussion, the meds, they were messing with my head. But then the noises started. It began with whispers. Faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pressed the call button for the nurse, but no one came. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. They were inside my head. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I crept to the door and peeked through the tiny window. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, growing closer. Suddenly, the lights in my room flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the city lights outside. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of my room. It wasn't the woman from before. This was something else. Tall, shadowy, its form shifting like smoke. Eyes, glowing, red eyes, stared at me from the darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing began to move closer, and the temperature dropped so much I could see my breath. A voice, deep, guttural, and wrong, whispered my name. "Leave me alone," I screamed, pressing myself against the wall. And then, silence. The figure vanished. The lights flickered back on. I thought it was over. I wanted to believe it was over. But when I looked down, I saw something that made my stomach churn. Scratched into the floor by my bed were 3 words, "You are next." I bolted out of the room, my broken arm throbbing in protest. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I ran toward the nurse's station, but no one was there. "Hello!" I shouted. My voice echoed down the corridor. Then I heard it. A faint, metallic screeching sound coming from the north wing, the closed-off wing. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic thud of footsteps. Against every ounce of instinct screaming at me to run, I turned and saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Patients in hospital gowns, doctors with faces twisted in agony, nurses with bloodied uniforms. They moved slowly, shambling toward me, their hollow eyes locked on mine. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. But no matter how far I went, the sound of their footsteps stayed close. I turned a corner and found myself facing a dead end, a boarded-up door with rusted chains. I could hear them behind me. I pressed myself against the door, sobbing, begging for it to open. And then a voice whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have come." Something grabbed my arm, cold, clammy, and strong, and pulled me back. I screamed, thrashing wildly. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was done for. But then, "Hey, are you okay?" A nurse was shaking me awake. I was back in my room, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Morning light streamed through the window. It was over, or so I thought. As the nurse checked my vitals, I glanced at the floor by my bed. The scratches were gone, but when I looked closer, I faint smudges of red like dried blood trailing toward the door. I left St. Helena that morning, and I've never been back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers, and when I close my eyes, I see them. The patients, the doctors, the nurses, they're waiting for me to come back. I think they always will.
Story number 2.
It wasn't my first time in a hospital. I'd visited my share of ERs, stayed a few nights in recovery wards, but nothing prepared me for St. Anne's. The name alone feels heavy, doesn't it? St. Anne's Mercy Hospital. They say mercy is for the living, but that place was for the dead. I ended up there last October after collapsing at work. Doctors said it was exhaustion, maybe dehydration. I didn't argue. I'd been burning the candle at both ends for months. They decided to admit me for overnight observation, hooked me up to an IV, and wheeled me into room 406. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't just air-conditioned cold. It was deep, bone-chilling, like stepping into a cellar. I mentioned it to the nurse, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, and she just nodded, avoiding my gaze. "Old building," she said. "Drafty." I didn't buy it, but I was too tired to care. After she left, I tried to sleep, but something felt off. The room was too quiet. Hospitals are never quiet. There's always the hum of machines, the shuffle of feet in the hall, the occasional beep of a monitor, but here, nothing. Just silence, thick and pressing, like the walls were holding their breath. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of shuffling. Not in the hallway, inside my room. My heart skipped, and I turned my head slowly toward the sound. A figure stood at the foot of my bed. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. His head hung low, and his arms dangled at his sides. His skin was a sickly gray, almost translucent, and his hair was damp, clinging to his skull. "Hell," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't move. He just stood there, swaying slightly, like he was barely holding himself up. I fumbled for the call button, but my hand froze when he lifted his head. His eyes, milky white and lifeless, locked onto mine. His mouth opened, and a wet, gurgling sound filled the room. I screamed. I don't even remember hitting the call button, but within seconds the nurse burst in, flipping on the light. The man was gone, just like that. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp. "There was someone in here," I stammered. "A man. He was standing right there." The nurse glanced around, her expression tight. "No one's here, honey. You had a nightmare." "It wasn't a nightmare," I insisted, but she just gave me that patronizing smile people reserve for hysterical patients. She checked my vitals, told me to get some rest, and left. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every shadow in the room felt alive, every creak of the floor a warning. And then, just before dawn, I heard it again. The shuffling. This time it wasn't in my room. It was coming from the hallway. I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the tiny window in the door. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, growing louder, closer. I backed away as the shuffling stopped right outside my door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. The door didn't open. Instead, the knob stopped moving, and a faint whisper seeped through the crack in the door. It wasn't English, at least not any English I'd ever heard. It was low and guttural, like someone choking on their words. I pressed myself against the far wall, clutching the blanket like it could somehow protect me. The whispers grew louder, angrier, until they abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Morning finally came, and with it, a new nurse. She was younger, friendlier, and seemed genuinely concerned when I told her what had happened. "This place is weird," she admitted, lowering her voice. "A lot of staff won't work the night shift. Too many incidents." "What kind of incidents?" I asked, dreading the answer. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "People seeing things, hearing voices, doors opening and closing on their own. Room 406, your room, It's known for activity. They say a patient died in here a long time ago. An older man. Heart attack, I think. Ever since, people have reported strange things, but it's just stories, you know? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. By the time night fell again, I was a nervous wreck. I begged the staff to move me to another room, but they were full. One more night, the nurse promised. You'll be discharged in the morning. I spent most of the night sitting up in bed, every light in the room turned on. I thought maybe the brightness would keep the shadows at bay, but as the hours dragged on, the lights began to flicker. At first, it was subtle, a quick dimming, then back to normal. But soon the flickering grew erratic, plunging the room into brief, strobe-like flashes of darkness. In one of those flashes, I saw him again. The man. He was crouched in the corner, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, his milky eyes gleaming in the sporadic light. He crawled toward me, his movements jerky and inhuman, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. I screamed, pressing myself against the headboard, but he didn't stop. His mouth opened wide, wider than it should have been, revealing rows of jagged, black teeth. "Leave me alone," I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by a sudden, deafening roar. The lights exploded, plunging the room into complete darkness, and then nothing. When I woke up, it was morning. The lights were back on and the room looked normal, but I wasn't. My arm had deep, angry scratches running from my wrist to my elbow. The nurse came in with my discharge papers, her cheerful demeanor fading the moment she saw my arm. "What happened?" she asked, horrified. "I told you," I whispered, my voice hollow. "There's something in this room." She didn't respond, just handed me the papers and helped me get dressed. As I left the room, I glanced back one last time. The air seemed thicker in there, darker. I swear I saw the shadow of a man standing by the bed. I haven't been back to St. Anne's since, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the shuffling and I know he's still watching.
Story number 3.
You never think much about hospitals until you're stuck in one. To most people, they're places of healing, bright lights, and sterile smells. But me, I know better now. I know what hides in the shadows, what lurks in the places no one talks about. And it started the night I was admitted to Ridgemont General. I was there for something minor, appendicitis. They whisked me into surgery, and everything went fine. By the time I woke up, they told me I'd stay overnight for monitoring. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. But they didn't tell me about the 7th floor. The elevator doors had barely closed behind me when the nurse pushing my wheelchair frowned. "Oh," she muttered. "We're going up there?" "What's wrong with up there?" I asked, already uneasy. She hesitated. "It's probably nothing. Just sometimes weird things happen on the 7th floor. Patients say it's haunted." She forced a laugh, but her knuckles tightened on the wheelchair handles. I didn't laugh back. The 7th floor was quiet. Too quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale, sickly glow over the empty hallway. My room was at the very end, past a row of closed doors. As the nurse helped me into bed, I noticed her glancing over her shoulder. "If you need anything," she said quickly, "just press the call button. Someone will come." She left without another word, and the heavy silence settled in. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but the signal was spotty. Static hissed from the screen, the black and white fuzz occasionally flickering into distorted images. After a while, I gave up and turned it off. That's when I noticed it, the smell. It was faint at first, like rotting flowers. It grew stronger, sour and sickening, filling the room. I buzzed for a nurse, but no one came. I waited, clutching the blanket, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, soft but unmistakable. "Help! Me!" My heart stopped. The voice was coming from the hallway. It was weak, trembling, like someone barely clinging to life. I told myself it was another patient, someone in pain, but something about it felt wrong. Against my better judgment, I slid out of bed and shuffled to the door, clutching my IV pole for support. The hallway was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help! Me!" It was coming from the room next door, room 712. The door was ajar, its darkness beckoning. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to go back to bed. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. No patient, no furniture, just bare walls and a cracked window. The smell of rot was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. "Help me!" The voice came again, louder, angrier. It wasn't just in the room, it was everywhere, surrounding me. I spun around, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, was a figure. A woman, thin and pale, her hospital gown hanging off her emaciated frame. Her hair was matted, her eyes wide and sunken, filled with a desperation that made my skin crawl. "Please," she rasped, reaching out a skeletal hand. "Don't let him take me." "Who?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Who's gonna take you?" Her eyes darted to the doorway, and her face twisted in terror. "He's here." I turned, and for a split second I saw him. A tall, shadowy figure, featureless except for glowing red eyes. He stood in the doorway, his presence suffocating. The woman let out a blood-curdling scream, and when I turned back, she was gone. The room was empty again, but the smell lingered, heavy and oppressive. I stumbled back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the lock in place. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and prayed for morning. But the night was far from over. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate, each one echoing down the hallway. I held my breath, hoping it was just a nurse making rounds. But the footsteps stopped right outside my room. The doorknob rattled. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door came 3 loud, deliberate knocks. Bang! 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 I froze, unable to move or even think. The knocks came again, louder this time, shaking the door on its hinges, and then, without warning, they stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the morning finally came, I asked the day nurse if anyone had been on the floor during the night. She frowned. "No, we don't staff the 7th floor overnight. Patients up here are usually stable enough not to need constant monitoring." My blood ran cold. "Why?" "It's just how it's always been," she said, avoiding my gaze. "But if you're uncomfortable, I can see about moving you to another floor." I was discharged later that afternoon, but the events of that night have stayed with me. I've done some research since then, and what I've found only confirmed my fears. The 7th floor of Ridgemont General used to be the hospital's psychiatric ward. In the 1960s, a fire broke out, killing several patients and staff. Among them was a woman named Lila Barnes, a long-term patient who claimed she was being hunted by a shadow man. She was found in her room, claw marks on the walls, and her eyes wide open in terror. Her room, 712. I haven't told many people this story. Most wouldn't believe me. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I hear it again, the faint whisper of a woman's voice. "Help. Me."
Story number 4.
You never think much about dying until you feel its icy fingers brush against you. I wasn't even sick, just a minor stomach bug. But my visit to Northwood Memorial Hospital that night wasn't about my health. It was about survival. I checked in around 8 p.m. The ER was bustling, filled with the usual chaos. Crying children, groaning patients, the sharp smell of antiseptics. They told me it would be a long wait, so I settled into one of the plastic chairs and tried to distract myself with my phone. But from the moment I stepped into the building, I felt wrong. It wasn't just the usual unease of being in a hospital. It was something deeper, like the air itself didn't want me there. Cold drafts brushed past me, even though the room was sealed tight. And then there was the mural. The waiting area wall had a massive mural depicting doctors and nurses, their painted smiles bright and friendly. But the longer I stared, the more unsettling it became. Their eyes seemed too sharp, their smiles too wide. The artist's brushstrokes made them look alive, almost watching. I shook it off as nerves and tried to focus on my phone, but that feeling of being watched didn't go away. Finally, around midnight, they called my name. The nurse, a tired-looking woman with deep bags under her eyes, led me down a long corridor to a private room. The farther we walked, the quieter it got. By the time we reached my room, the only sounds were the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the squeak of her shoes on the linoleum floor. "Here we are," she said, opening the door to room 313. Her tone was flat, almost robotic. "Thanks," I said, stepping inside. But she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring past me into the room. "Are you okay?" I asked. She blinked, shook her head, and muttered, "Don't let it in." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me frozen in the doorway. I should have left right then. Every instinct told me to run, but instead, I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The room was like any other hospital room. Bland walls, a single bed, and a monitor that beeped softly in the corner. I climbed into bed, trying to convince myself that the nurse was just overtired or playing some weird joke. But the unease grew stronger, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. At 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the window. My room was on the 3rd floor. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. The blinds were half closed, leaving just enough space to see out. And there, pressed against the glass, was a face. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Its eyes were sunken pits of darkness, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. It tilted its head as if studying me, and then it raised a skeletal hand to tap on the glass again. Tap, tap, tap. I scrambled out of bed, backing toward the door. My trembling hands fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. The tapping stopped. I looked back at the window, but the face was gone. Relief flooded me, until I heard it. A low, guttural whisper. Let me in. It wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was inside the room. I spun around, and there it was. The thing stood in the corner, its twisted body hunched over, its eyes fixed on me. It moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, the air growing colder with every inch it closed between us. Please, it rasped. Let me in. I don't know what you want, I screamed, pressing myself against the door. Its grin widened, splitting its face almost in half. You're already mine. I don't remember what happened next. Maybe I passed out. Maybe I blacked out from fear. When I woke up, it was morning. The sunlight streaming through the window made the room look almost normal, but the sense of dread remained. The nurse from the night before came in, her face pale. She wouldn't meet my eyes as she handed me my discharge papers. You're free to go, she said quickly, then turned to leave. Wait, I said. What happened last night? She stopped in the doorway, her shoulders tense. You survived. That's all that matters. I didn't press her. I didn't want to know more. I just wanted to leave. As I walked out of the hospital, I passed the mural in the waiting area, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the painted doctors in the mural was grinning wider than before. His eyes, sharp and black, followed me as I walked by, and his hand, it was raised in a tap, tap, tap against the painted glass. I ran out of there and never looked back. It's been months since that night, but I still feel it sometimes. When I'm alone in my apartment, I hear the tapping. Soft at first, then louder, and sometimes, late at night, I see its face reflected in the glass, grinning back at me. It's waiting, and I know it won't wait forever.
Story number 5.
I never liked cemeteries. I mean, who does? But my shift at the morgue right next to Rosewood Cemetery wasn't something I could avoid. It was just part of the job, right? At least, that's what I told myself when I signed the contract. The dead can't hurt you, people always say. Turns out that's not entirely true. I worked nights at Briar Hill Hospital down in the basement where they kept the morgue. Hence, the hospital itself was old, built in the 1920s, with creaking pipes and flickering lights that made everything feel like a scene from a horror movie. But I needed the money, and after a few months, I got used to the eerie silence, the cold air, and even the faint smell of formaldehyde. It was the week before Halloween when things started to get strange. The first incident happened during a routine shift. I was alone, as usual, logging the new arrivals. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking. At first, I thought it was the old pipes. The basement always made weird noises, but this wasn't random. It was deliberate. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from one of the storage drawers where we kept the bodies. My heart stopped. Just the pipes, I whispered to myself, but my hands were trembling as I walked toward the drawer. The sound stopped as soon as I reached it. It was drawer 7. The tag on the outside read Jane Doe. She'd come in earlier that day, unidentified, found dead near Rosewood Cemetery. No visible injuries, no apparent cause of death, just dead. I stood there for a moment, staring at the drawer. Then I shook my head and walked away. But as soon as I sat down at my desk, the knocking started again. Knock. Knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Okay, I muttered, grabbing a pair of gloves. Let's see what's going on. I slid the drawer open, my breath fogging in the cold air. Jane Doe lay there, pale and still, her eyes closed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I noticed her hand. It was clenched into a tight fist. That was strange. The bodies are usually relaxed, their muscles slack after death. I hesitated, then gently pried her fingers open. Inside her palm was a small, crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't part of the usual intake process. Curious, I unfolded it. Let me rest. My stomach dropped. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry. I glanced back at her face, half expecting her to open her eyes, but she didn't move. I shoved the note in my pocket, closed the drawer, and spent the rest of the shift trying to convince myself it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of the paramedics thought it would be funny. But that didn't explain what happened the next night. I was back in the morgue, logging paperwork, when the power went out. Everything went black, except for the faint glow of the emergency lights. I grabbed a flashlight and tried to stay calm, but the silence was deafening. And then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. But this time, it wasn't just one drawer. It was all of them. The sound echoed through the room, growing louder and more frantic. I swung the flashlight toward the storage drawers, and my heart nearly stopped. The drawers were moving. One by one, they began sliding open as if something inside was trying to escape. I froze, unable to breathe, as the knocking turned into banging. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The banging stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then slowly, the drawer with Jane Doe slid open. Her eyes were open now, wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. "Let me rest," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible, but it was enough to send me running out of the room. I didn't go back until morning when the day shift coroner arrived. I tried to explain what happened, but he just laughed it off. "Long nights mess with your head," he said, clapping me on the back. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But things only got worse. The next night, the smell hit me as soon as I walked into the morgue. It was foul, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. I checked the refrigeration system, but everything was functioning normally. Still, the stench clung to the air, growing stronger with every passing hour. Around midnight, the lights began to flicker. The cold grew unbearable, even for the morgue. I could see my breath and my fingers felt numb. And then I saw her. Jane Doe was standing at the end of the room, her hospital gown torn and blood-stained. Her eyes were hollow, her skin gray and lifeless. "You didn't listen," she rasped, her voice echoing unnaturally. "What do you want from me?" I yelled, backing against the wall. "Rest," she hissed. "I want to rest." Before I could respond, she lunged at me, her hands outstretched. I stumbled and fell, my head hitting the floor. When I woke up, I was alone. The room was silent again, the drawers closed, the stench gone. But on my desk was another note, written in the same shaky handwriting. "Bury me." I didn't wait for my shift to end. I pulled her drawer open, grabbed the body, and drove straight to Rosewood Cemetery. I didn't care if anyone saw me or what they would think. I just knew I had to get her out of the hospital. The cemetery was dark and overgrown, the headstones cracked and leaning. I found a spot near the edge of the property, dug a shallow grave with my bare hands, and laid her body to rest. As I covered her with dirt, the air grew warmer, shalko, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. When I returned to the hospital, the morgue felt normal. The lights stayed on, the air was clean, and there were no more knocks. I don't know who Jane Doe was or what happened to her, but I know one thing for sure. Some spirits don't find peace until you give it to them. And now, every time I pass Rosewood Cemetery, I feel her watching. Not with anger, but with gratitude. At least that's what I tell myself.
Story number 6.
I never believed in ghosts. They were the stuff of urban legends, exaggerated stories passed around campfires or dramatized in movies. But that was before I worked the night shift at West Hollow Asylum. That was before I saw him. West Hollow was an old psychiatric hospital that had long since been repurposed into a rehabilitation center. The original building, though, still stood on the property, a crumbling, decrepit structure cordoned off with rusted fences and warning signs. Nobody went inside. Nobody even talked about it. I worked as an overnight security guard, patrolling the new building and its surrounding grounds. The job was boring, but it paid well, and I figured it was easy money. That was until the night I saw the light. It started around 1 a.m. I was making my rounds, walking past the old asylum, when I noticed a faint glow coming from one of the upper windows. My first thought was that it was a trespasser, maybe some kids messing around. But as I got closer, I realized the light wasn't natural. It pulsed, dimming and brightening like a heartbeat. I radioed my partner, Keith, who was monitoring the security cameras inside the new building. "Hey, you seeing anything in the old wing?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the glowing window. "Negative," Keith replied. "Cameras don't cover that area, remember?" "Yeah, well, something's up there," I said. "I'm gonna check it out." "You sure that's a good idea?" Keith sounded uneasy. "That place is falling apart. It's not safe." "I'll be quick," I promised. Probably just some kids. I wish I'd listened to him. The fence surrounding the old building was easy enough to slip through. The main door was locked, but one of the side windows had been broken out long ago. I climbed through, landing in what used to be the reception area. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, and the faint hum of the light above me seemed to echo through the silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the crumbling walls. No response. The light was coming from the third floor. I made my way up the decaying staircase, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Each step creaked under my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was alive, watching me. When I reached the third floor, the light had disappeared. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with doors that hung crooked on their hinges. The paint on the walls was peeling, revealing layers of graffiti and old, yellowed wallpaper. "Anybody here?" I called again, but the only response was the sound of my own breathing. I started walking down the hall, checking each room as I passed. Most of them were empty, filled with nothing but broken furniture and piles of debris. But when I reached the last room on the left, I froze. The door was ajar, and inside, the light was back, glowing faintly, casting long shadows on the walls. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Let's get this over with." I pushed the door open. The room was small, with a single bed frame bolted to the floor and a cracked mirror on the wall. The light was coming from an old lantern sitting in the corner, flickering like a dying flame. And then I saw him. He was sitting on the bed, his back to me. His figure was thin and hunched, his head hanging low. He was wearing what looked like a hospital gown, its fabric torn and stained. "Sir?" I said cautiously, stepping into the room. "You're not supposed to be here." He didn't respond. I took another step closer, shining my flashlight on him. His shoulders were shaking, and at first I thought he was crying. But then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. He was laughing. "Sir, I need you to..." I started, but before I could finish, he turned. His face, it wasn't right. His skin was pale and stretched too tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and glowing faintly in the dim light. His mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were sharp and jagged. "Stay," he whispered, his voice raspy and hollow. "Stay with me." I stumbled backward, tripping over the doorframe as he stood. His movements were jerky, almost inhuman, as he took a step toward me. The lantern's light flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly as I sprinted toward the stairs. Behind me, I could hear him laughing, louder now, echoing through the building. "Stay!" he shouted, his voice reverberating like a chorus of whispers. I reached the stairs and nearly fell in my desperation to get down them. The wood groaned under my weight, and I half expected it to collapse beneath me. When I reached the first floor, I didn't stop. I ran straight for the window I'd climbed through and dove out, landing hard on the ground outside. The night air was cold, and for a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath. When I finally looked back at the building, the light in the window was gone. I didn't tell Keith what happened. I didn't tell anyone. I finished my shift in silence and quit the next day. A week later, I heard on the news that the old asylum had been demolished. They said it was a hazard, unsafe for anyone to enter. Part of me felt relieved, like the nightmare was finally over. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear him, that low, guttural laugh echoing in the back of my mind, and I can't help but wonder if he's really gone, or if he's just waiting for someone else to wander into the dark.
Story number 7.
My hands are shaking as I write this. I don't know if sharing this story will help me find peace, or if it's just my way of trying to convince myself it really happened. But I need to tell someone. I need someone to believe me. It started 6 months ago when I moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was cheap, suspiciously so, but I didn't care. I was starting over after a bad breakup, and the place felt like a fresh start. It was old and a little rundown, but it had character. Hardwood floors, tall windows, and a view of the nearby park. The only thing I didn't like was the mirror. It hung in the hallway, bolted to the wall. An antique piece with a heavy, ornate frame carved with twisting vines and roses. It didn't match the rest of the apartment, and no matter how much I cleaned it, the glass always looked cloudy, clucked foul, like it was hiding something just beneath the surface. The landlord said it came with the place and couldn't be removed. "It's part of the building's history," she explained when I asked about it. "Just leave it be." I should have taken that as a warning. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened. I spent my days working and my nights unpacking, trying to make the apartment feel like home. But then, little by little, the strange things began. It started with noises, soft creaks and whispers that I thought were the old building settling. Then objects began to move. Keys disappearing from the counter only to reappear on the coffee table, lights flickering without reason. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was my imagination. But then I started seeing the reflections. It happened late one night when I was walking past the mirror on my way to bed. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I stopped, turning to look directly at the glass, but all I saw was my own tired reflection. "Just your mind playing tricks," I muttered, shaking my head. But as I turned away, there it was again, a flicker of movement, quick and subtle. This time I stared at the mirror, my pulse racing. At first, there was nothing. But then, slowly, something began to take shape in the cloudy glass. A shadow. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to send me stumbling back. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I covered the mirror with a blanket, hoping that would solve the problem. For a while, it did. The noises stopped, and the apartment felt normal again. But 2 weeks later, the blanket fell off. I found it crumpled on the floor one morning, even though I was certain I'd secured it tightly. The mirror was exposed again, and the uneasy feeling returned, like I was being watched. That night, I dreamed of the mirror. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, unable to move. The glass was clear, clearer than it had ever been, and I could see a figure on the other side. It was a woman, her face pale and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She reached out, pressing her hands against the glass, her lips moving as if she were trying to speak. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. I started avoiding the hallway entirely, refusing to even glance at the mirror. But the figure in the glass wasn't content to stay hidden. One evening, as I sat on the couch, I heard a soft tapping sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin crawl. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway. I forced myself to look, and my blood ran cold. The woman from my dream was there, her face pressed against the inside of the mirror, her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and her lips curled into a chilling smile. "Let me out," she whispered. Her voice was soft but carried an unnatural echo, as if it were coming from all around me. I ran out of the apartment that night, checking into a motel across town. I called the landlord the next morning, demanding an explanation. She was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "You saw her, didn't you?" "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "The mirror," she said. "It's cursed. Everyone who's lived there has seen her eventually." "Why didn't you tell me?" I yelled. "I didn't think she'd bother you," she said weakly. "She only shows herself to certain people. People she thinks she can use." "Use for what?" "To take her place," she said. "To trade places with her." I hung up and immediately started looking for a new apartment. But leaving wasn't that simple. The woman in the mirror didn't want me to go. That night, back at the motel, I woke up to find the mirror from the apartment leaning against the wall at the foot of my bed. I have no idea how it got there. She was in it again, her hands pressed against the glass, her smile wider than before. "You can't run," she whispered. I smashed the mirror with a chair, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. But when I turned to leave, I saw her reflection in the motel's bathroom mirror. She's still with me. Every mirror I pass, she's there, watching, waiting. I can't escape her. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The reflections are getting clearer, and her voice is getting louder. She wants me to let her out, and I'm afraid that one day I will.
Story number 8.
I didn't grow up believing in ghosts, spirits, or the supernatural. That kind of stuff was for movies and ghost hunters on late-night TV. But there's something about an old family home, something about the history that clings to the walls, that makes you question everything you thought you knew. My family's house sat on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania, a towering Victorian relic built by my great-great-grandfather in the late 1800s. It had been passed down through generations, and when my parents retired and moved south, I was the only one willing to take it on. I moved in during the fall when the leaves were just starting to turn and the evenings were chilly. The house was enormous, 3 stories tall, with a sprawling attic and a basement that smelled like damp earth. It was beautiful, sure, but it had a way of making you feel small, like you were trespassing in someone else's space. The first few nights were uneventful. I was busy unpacking, figuring out how to navigate the maze of creaky floors and long hallways. But then the dreams started. At first, they were just fragments. Shadows moving across the walls, whispers I couldn't quite make out, but they grew more vivid with each passing night. I dreamed of a little girl in a white dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon. She would stand at the foot of my bed, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Come play," she whispered in one dream, her voice soft but insistent. I always woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. But what really scared me was the feeling that lingered after I woke, the sense that I wasn't alone. One night, after another dream about the girl, I decided to look into the house's history. I went through old family journals, yellowed newspaper clippings, anything I could find. That's when I discovered the story of Emily. Emily was my great-great-great-grandfather's youngest daughter. She had died in the house when she was just 8 years old. An accident, they said. She'd fallen down the grand staircase, breaking her neck. But there were whispers, even back then, that it wasn't an accident. The rumors hinted at something darker, something no one wanted to say out loud. And as I dug deeper, I found entries in an old journal that chilled me to the bone. My great-great-grandfather had written about Emily's behavior in the weeks before her death. "She isn't herself," one entry read. "She talks to people who aren't there. She says they want her to stay forever." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint sounds, footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the staircase. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down, I knew better. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft giggle, high-pitched and unmistakably that of a child. "Come play," a voice whispered, so close it made my skin crawl. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, but I could feel her presence. "Who's there?" I managed to croak. The air grew colder, and the faint outline of a figure appeared near the door. It was the girl from my dreams, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. "Play with me," she said, her head tilting unnaturally to the side. I jumped out of bed and ran to the light switch, flooding the room with light. But she was gone. The next morning I called my parents and demanded to know why they'd never told me about Emily. "We didn't think it mattered," my mom said, her voice hesitant. "The house is old, and every old house has its stories." "It's not just a story," I snapped. "She's still here." There was a long pause before my mom finally spoke again. "You're not the first to say that," she admitted. "Your grandmother used to talk about hearing Emily's voice. She said Emily would call her name, ask her to play. But it's just the house, sweetie. It plays tricks on your mind." I didn't argue. I knew what I'd seen. That night, I decided to confront Emily. I wasn't sure what else to do. I couldn't keep living like this, afraid of my own house. I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, clutching a flashlight and the old journal I'd found. "Emily," I said, my voice trembling, "if you're here, I just want to talk." The room grew colder, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Why won't you play with me?" her voice whispered from the shadows. I turned the flashlight toward the staircase, and there she was, standing on the landing. Her dress was torn and dirty, her face pale and expressionless. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started up the stairs, her figure flickering like a dying flame. I hesitated but followed her, the flashlight shaking in my hand. She led me to the attic, a place I'd avoided since moving in. The air was stifling, heavy with dust and decay. In the corner of the attic was a small trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Emily stood beside it, her dark eyes fixed on me. "Open it," she said. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were old toys. A porcelain doll with a cracked face, a wooden spinning top, and a small, leather-bound book. The book fell open to a page covered in messy, childish handwriting. "I don't like him," it read. "He says I have to stay, but I want to leave. I want to leave so bad." I looked up, but Emily was gone. I left the house the next day. I didn't pack much, just what I could fit in my car. I don't know who he was or why Emily couldn't leave, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I still dream about her sometimes. I see her standing at the foot of my bed, her hollow eyes watching me. And in those dreams, she always whispers the same thing. "Why did you leave me?"
Story number 9.
I thought moving back to my hometown would bring me peace. I wanted a quieter life, a break from the chaos of the city. What I got was something else entirely, something that haunts me to this day. The house was an old colonial, the kind of place that creaked when the wind blew and smelled faintly of wood and earth. It had been my grandparents' home before they passed, left to sit empty for years. When I inherited it, I decided to move in and fix it up. It felt right, like reconnecting with my roots. From the moment I stepped inside, though, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. The house was clean, the sunlight streamed through the windows, and everything looked just as I remembered it. But there was an undercurrent, a sensation I couldn't quite place, like the house was holding its breath. The first night, I chalked up the strange noises to the house settling. The faint creaks, the soft thuds, normal for a building this old. But as the days went on, the noises grew louder and stranger. I'd hear footsteps upstairs when I was in the kitchen, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor in the dining room while I was in bed. Once, I heard a faint knock on the wall next to me while I was watching TV. Just an old house, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But then things started moving. It began small. A book left on the coffee table would end up on the floor. A cabinet door I knew I'd closed would be open. I started to question my memory, wondering if I was just being careless. But I couldn't explain what happened one morning when I walked into the living room to find all the furniture pushed against the walls. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The house answered with silence. I moved the furniture back, trying to convince myself it was some bizarre prank. Maybe a neighbor's kid had snuck in, though I couldn't figure out how. The doors were locked. That night, I heard the humming for the first time. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of the wind. But as I lay in bed, it grew louder, more distinct. It was a melody, slow and haunting, sung by a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone standing just outside my bedroom door. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The humming continued for what felt like hours before it finally stopped, leaving the house in a silence so heavy it felt oppressive. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of my bedroom door. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd done it without realizing, or maybe they'd always been there, and I just never noticed. But deep down, I knew better. I decided to do some digging into the house's history. My grandparents had always been private, and I realized I didn't know much about the house beyond the fact that they'd lived there for decades. At the local library, I found an old newspaper article that stopped me cold. "Family Tragedy at Colonial Home," the headline read. The article detailed a murder-suicide that had taken place in the house in the 1940s. A man named Samuel, his wife, and their daughter had lived there. Samuel, it seemed, had become convinced that his family was possessed by evil spirits. One night he'd killed them both before hanging himself in the attic. The attic. I'd never been up there. That night, the humming returned, louder than ever. It seemed to fill the house, resonating through the walls and floor. "Leave," a voice whispered, so close it felt like someone was right next to me. I sat up in bed, my body trembling. "Who are you?" I whispered back. There was no answer, and it just the faint sound of a door creaking open. I grabbed my flashlight and went into the hallway. The door to the attic, which I knew had been shut and locked, was now ajar. Every instinct told me to run, to leave the house and never come back. But something drew me toward that door, a strange pull I couldn't resist. The attic stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the top, I could see my breath. The attic was empty, except for a single chair sitting in the center of the room. A rope hung from the rafters above it, swaying gently as if it had just been disturbed. The humming started again, louder and more oppressive. I turned to leave, but the attic door slammed shut behind me. "Stay," the voice whispered. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room. That's when I saw them. Two figures stood in the corner, a woman and a little girl. Their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes hollow. The woman held the girl's hand, her expression one of deep sadness. "We can't leave," the woman said, her voice trembling. "He won't let us." "Who?" I asked, my voice shaking. Before she could answer, a third figure appeared. Samuel. He stood in the shadows, his eyes glowing faintly, a twisted smile on his face. "They're mine," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And now, so are you." The air grew heavy, pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The last thing I remember is Samuel's face inches from mine, his breath cold against my skin. When I woke up, I was lying in the front yard. The house loomed above me, dark and silent. I didn't go back inside. I packed what I could fit in my car and drove away, leaving everything else behind. The house still stands, but I don't know who lives there now. I wonder if they've heard the humming, if they've seen Samuel or the family he refuses to let go. I wonder if they'll get out before it's too late.